War in Afghanistan, 2001 to 2018, History. U.S. invasion of Afghanistan. Immediately after the attacks, General Tommy Franks, then Commanding General of Central Command, CENTCOM, initially proposed to President George W. Bush and Secretary of Defense Donald Rumsfeld that the U.S. invade Afghanistan using a conventional force of 60,000 troops, preceded by 6 months of preparation. Rumsfeld and Bush feared that a conventional invasion of Afghanistan could bog down as had happened to the Soviets and the British. Rumsfeld rejected Franks's plan, saying, "I want men on the ground now." Franks returned the next day with a plan utilizing U.S. Special Forces. On September 26, 2001, 15 days after the 9/11 attack, the U.S. covertly inserted members of the CIA's Special Activities Division led by Gary Schroen as part of Team Jawbreaker into Afghanistan, forming the Northern Afghanistan Liaison Team. They linked up with the Northern Alliance as part of Task Force Dagger. 2 weeks later, Task Force Dagger, Operational Detachment Alpha, ODA, 555 and 595, both 12-man Green Beret teams from 5th Special Forces Group, plus Air Force combat controllers, were airlifted by helicopter from the Karshi-Khanabad Air Base in Uzbekistan more than 300 kilometers, 190 miles, across the 16,000 feet, 4,900 meters, Hindu Kush Mountains in zero visibility conditions by 2 SOAR MH-47E Chinook helicopters. The Chinooks were refueled in flight 3 times during the 11-hour mission, establishing a new world record for combat rotorcraft missions at the time. They linked up with the CIA and Northern Alliance. Within a few weeks, the Northern Alliance, with assistance from the U.S. ground and air forces, captured several key cities from the Taliban. The U.S. officially launched Operation Enduring Freedom on October 7, 2001, with the assistance of the United Kingdom. The two were later joined by other countries. The U.S. and its allies drove the Taliban from power and built military bases near major cities across the country. Most Al-Qaeda and Taliban were not captured, escaping to neighboring Pakistan or retreating to rural or remote mountainous regions. On December 20, 2001, the United Nations authorized an International Security Assistance Force, ISAF, with a mandate to help the Afghans maintain security in Kabul and surrounding areas. It was initially established from the headquarters of the British 3rd Mechanized Division under Major General John McCall, and for its first years numbered no more than 5,000. Its mandate did not extend beyond the Kabul area for the first few years. 18 countries were contributing to the force in February 2002. At the Bonn Conference in December 2001, Hamid Karzai was selected to head the Afghan interim administration, which after a 2002 Loya Jirga in Kabul became the Afghan Transitional Administration. In the popular elections of 2004, Karzai was elected president of the country, now named the Islamic Republic of Afghanistan. Post-Anaconda operations. Following the battle at Shahi-Kot, Al-Qaeda fighters established sanctuaries on the Pakistani border, where they launched cross-border raids beginning in the summer of 2002. Guerrilla units, numbering between 5 and 25 men, regularly crossed the border to fire rockets at coalition bases, ambush convoys and patrols and assault non-governmental organizations. The area around the Shkin base in Paktika province saw some of the heaviest activity. Taliban fighters remained in hiding in the rural regions of 4 southern provinces, Kandahar, Zabul, Helmand, and Uruzgan. After Anaconda, the Department of Defense requested British Royal Marines, highly trained in mountain warfare, to be deployed. In response, 45 Commando deployed under the operational codename Operation Jacana in April 2002. They conducted missions, including Operation Snipe, Operation Condor, and Operation Buzzard, over several weeks with varying results. The Taliban avoided combat. In May 2002, Combined Joint Task Force 180 became the senior U.S. military headquarters in the country, under Lieutenant General Dan K. McNeill. Later in 2002, ISAF became a single integrated command under the broader CJTF 180 that commanded all U.S. forces assigned to OFA. It was built around an Army Special Forces group, often manned by National Guard units, and SEAL teams. A small JSOC element, formerly Task Force Sword/11, not under direct CTJF command, Embedded within ISAF, it was manned by a joint SEAL and Ranger element that rotated command. It was not under direct ISAF command, although it operated in support of NATO operations. 2003 to 2005 Taliban resurgence, war with Afghan forces. Pamphlets early 2003 turned up strewn in towns and countryside, by Taliban and other groups, urging Islamic faithful to rise up against U.S. forces and other foreign soldiers in holy war. On January 27, 2003, during Operation Mongoose, War in Afghanistan, a band of fighters were assaulted by U.S. forces at the Adigar Cave Complex 25 kilometers, 15 miles, north of Spinboldak. 18 rebels were reported killed with no U.S. casualties. The site was suspected to be a base for supplies and fighters coming from Pakistan. The first isolated attacks by relatively large Taliban bands on Afghan targets also appeared around that time. In May 2003, Taliban Supreme Court's Chief Justice, Abdul Salam, proclaimed that the Taliban were back, regrouped, rearmed, ready for guerrilla war to expel U.S. forces from Afghanistan. Omar assigned 5 operational zones to Taliban commanders such as Dadullah, who took charge in Kabul Province. Small mobile training camps were established along the border to train recruits in guerrilla warfare, said senior Taliban warrior Mullah Malong in June 2003. Most were drawn from tribal area madrasas in Pakistan. Bases, a few with as many as 200 fighters, emerged in the tribal areas by the summer of 2003. Pakistani will to prevent infiltration was uncertain, while Pakistani military operations proved of little use. As the summer of 2003 continued, Taliban attacks gradually increased in frequency. Dozens of Afghan government soldiers, NGO humanitarian workers, and several U.S. soldiers died in the raids, ambushes and rocket attacks. Besides guerrilla attacks, Taliban fighters began building up forces in the district of Daichopan in Kabul Province. The Taliban decided to make a stand there. Over the course of the summer, up to 1,000 guerrillas moved there. Over 220 people, including several dozen Afghan police, were killed in August 2003. On August 11, 2003, NATO assumed control of ISAF. Following NATO taking the helm at ISAF, some U.S. forces in Afghanistan operated under NATO command, the rest remained under direct U.S. command. Taliban leader Mullah Omar reorganized the movement, and in 2003, launched an insurgency against the government and ISAF. In late 2004, the then hidden Taliban leader Muhammad Omar announced an insurgency against America and its puppets, referring to transitional Afghan government forces, to regain the sovereignty of our country. In late August 2005, Afghan government forces attacked, backed by U.S. troops with air support. After a one-week battle, Taliban forces were routed with up to 124 fighters killed. On July 31, 2006, ISAF assumed command of the south of the country, and by October 5, 2006, of the east. Once this transition had taken place, ISAF grew to a large coalition involving up to 46 countries, under a U.S. commander. 2006, War between NATO forces and Taliban. From January 2006, a multinational ISAF contingent started to replace U.S. troops in southern Afghanistan. The British 16 Air Assault Brigade, later reinforced by Royal Marines, formed the core of the force, along with troops and helicopters from Australia, Canada and the Netherlands. The initial force consisted of roughly 3,300 British, 2,300 Canadian, 1,963 Dutch, 300 Australian, 290 Danish and 150 Estonian troops. Air support was provided by U.S., British, Dutch, Norwegian and French combat aircraft and helicopters. In January 2006, NATO's focus in southern Afghanistan was to form provincial reconstruction teams with the British leading in Helmand while the Netherlands and Canada would lead similar deployments in Uruzgan and Kandahar, respectively. Local Taliban figures pledged to resist. NATO operations in southern Afghanistan in 2006 were led by British, Canadian and Dutch commanders. Operation Mountain Thrust was launched on May 17, 2006. On May 29, 2006, while according to American website The Spokesman Review Afghanistan faced a mounting threat from armed Taliban fighters in the countryside, A U.S. military truck that was part of a convoy in Kabul lost control and plowed into 12 civilian vehicles, killing 1 and injuring 6 people. The surrounding crowd got angry and a riot arose, lasting all day, ending with 20 dead and 160 injured. When stone throwing and gunfire had come from a crowd of some 400 men, the U.S. troops had used their weapons to defend themselves while leaving the scene, a U.S. military spokesman said. A correspondent for the Financial Times in Kabul suggested that this was the outbreak of a groundswell of resentment and growing hostility to foreigners that had been growing and building since 2004, and may also have been triggered by a U.S. airstrike a week earlier in southern Afghanistan, killing 30 civilians, where she assumed that the Taliban had been sheltering in civilian houses. In July, Canadian forces, supported by U.S., British, Dutch and Danish forces, launched Operation Medusa. A combined force of Dutch and Australians launched a successful offensive between late April to mid-July 2006 to push the Taliban out of the Chora and Baluchi areas. On September 18, 2006, Italian Special Forces of Task Force 45 and airborne troopers of the Trieste Infantry Regiment of the Rapid Reaction Corps, composed of Italian and Spanish forces, took part in the weekend pincer operation in the districts of Bala Buluk and Pusht Irad, in Farah province. Italian forces killed at least 70 Taliban. The situation in RCW then deteriorated. Hotspots included Badghis in the far north and Farah in the southwest. Further NATO operations included the Battle of Panjwai, Operation Mountain Fury, and Operation Falcon Summit. NATO achieved tactical victories and area denial, but the Taliban were not completely defeated. NATO operations continued into 2007. 2007, U.S. buildup, ISAF war against Taliban. In January and February 2007, British Royal Marines mounted Operation Volcano to clear insurgents from firing points in the village of Barikju, north of Kajaki. Other major operations during this period included Operation Achilles, March to May, and Operation Last Take Along. The UK Ministry of Defence announced its intention to bring British troop levels in the country up to 7,700, committed until 2009. Further operations, such as Operation Silver and Operation Silicon, took place to keep up the pressure on the Taliban in the hope of blunting their expected spring offensive. In February 2007, Combined Forces Command Afghanistan inactivated. Combined Joint Task Force 76, a 2-star U.S. command headquartered on Bagram Airfield, assumed responsibility as the national command element for U.S. forces in Afghanistan. Combined Security Transition Command Afghanistan, or CSTCA, the other 2-star U.S. command, was charged with training and mentoring the Afghan National Security Forces. On March 4, 2007, U.S. Marines killed at least 12 civilians and injured 33 in Shinwar District, Nangarhar, in a response to a bomb ambush. The event became known as the Shinwar Massacre. The 120-member Marine unit responsible for the attack were ordered to leave the country by Army Major General Frank Carney, because the incident damaged the unit's relations with the local Afghan population. Later in March 2007, the U.S. during the Bush administration deployed another more than 3,500 troops to Afghanistan to expand the fight against the Taliban. On May 12, 2007, ISAF forces killed Mullah Dadullah. 11 other Taliban fighters died in the same firefight. During the summer, NATO forces achieved tactical victories at the Battle of Chora in Uruzgan, where Dutch and Australian ISAF forces were deployed. On 16 August, 8 civilians including a pregnant woman and a baby died when, few hours after an insurgent ambush damaged a Polish-wheeled armored vehicle, Polish soldiers shelled the village of Nangarhar, Paktika province. 7 soldiers were charged with war crimes, after locals stated the Polish unit fired mortar rounds and machine guns into a wedding celebration without provocation, but they were cleared of all charges in 2011. On 28 October about 80 Taliban fighters were killed in a 24-hour battle in Helmand. Western officials and analysts estimated the strength of Taliban forces at about 10,000 fighters fielded at any given time. Of that number, only 2,000 to 3,000 were highly motivated, full-time insurgents. The rest were volunteer units, made up of young Afghans, angered by deaths of Afghan civilians and military airstrikes and American detention of Muslim prisoners who had been held for years without being charged. In 2007, more foreign fighters came into Afghanistan than ever before, according to officials. Approximately 100 to 300 full-time combatants were foreigners, many from Pakistan, Uzbekistan, Chechnya, various Arab countries and perhaps even Turkey and western China. They were reportedly more violent, uncontrollable and extreme, often bringing superior video production or bomb-making expertise. On 2 November, security forces killed a top-ranking militant, Maulawi Abdul Manan, after he was caught crossing the border. The Taliban confirmed his death. On 10 November, the Taliban ambushed a patrol in eastern Afghanistan. This attack brought the U.S. death toll for 2007 to 100, making it the Americans' deadliest year in Afghanistan. The Battle of Musa Allah took place in December. Afghan units were the principal fighting force, supported by British forces. Taliban forces were forced out of the town. Reassessment and renewed commitment 2008. Admiral Mike Mullen, chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, said that while the situation in Afghanistan is precarious and urgent, the 10,000 additional troops needed there would be unavailable in any significant manner unless withdrawals from Iraq are made. The priority was Iraq first, Afghanistan second. In the first 5 months of 2008, the number of U.S. troops in Afghanistan increased by over 80% with a surge of 21,643 more troops, bringing the total from 26,607 in January to 48,250 in June. In September 2008, President Bush announced the withdrawal of over 8,000 from Iraq and a further increase of up to 4,500 in Afghanistan. In June 2008, British Prime Minister Gordon Brown announced the number of British troops serving in Afghanistan would increase to 8,030, a rise of 230. The same month, the UK lost its 100th serviceman. On 13 June, Taliban fighters demonstrated their ongoing strength, liberating all prisoners in Kandahar jail. The operation freed 1,200 prisoners, 400 of whom were Taliban, causing a major embarrassment for NATO. On July 13, 2008, a coordinated Taliban attack was launched on a remote NATO base at Waynat in Kunduz Province. On 19 August, French troops suffered their worst losses in Afghanistan in an ambush with 10 soldiers killed in action and 21 injured. Later in the month, an airstrike targeted a Taliban commander in Helmand Province and killed 90 civilians. Late August saw one of NATO's largest operations in Helmand, Operation Eagle's Summit, aiming to bring electricity to the region. On 3 September, commandos, believed to be U.S. Army Special Forces, landed by helicopter and attacked 3 houses close to a known enemy stronghold in Pakistan. The attack killed between 7 and 20 people. Local residents claimed that most of the dead were civilians. Pakistan condemned the attack, calling the incursion a gross violation of Pakistan's territory. On 6 September, in an apparent reaction, Pakistan announced an indefinite disconnection of supply lines. On 11 September, militants killed 2 U.S. troops in the east. This brought the total number of U.S. losses to 113, more than in any prior year. Several European countries set their own records, particularly the UK, who suffered 108 casualties. Taliban attacks on supply lines 2008. In November and December 2008, multiple incidents of major theft, robbery, and arson attacks afflicted NATO supply convoys in Pakistan. Transport companies south of Kabul were extorted for money by the Taliban. These incidents included the hijacking of a NATO convoy carrying supplies in Peshawar, the torching of cargo trucks and Humvees east of the Khyber Pass, and a half-dozen raids on NATO supply depots near Peshawar that destroyed 300 cargo trucks and Humvees in December 2008. U.S. action into Pakistan 2008 to 2009. An unnamed senior Pentagon official told the BBC that at some point between September 12, 2008, President Bush issued a classified order authorizing raids against militants in Pakistan. Pakistan said it would not allow foreign forces onto its territory and that it would vigorously protect its sovereignty. In September, the Pakistan military stated that it had issued orders to open fire on U.S. soldiers who crossed the border in pursuit of militant forces. On September 25, 2008, Pakistani troops fired on ISAF helicopters. This caused confusion and anger in the Pentagon, which asked for a full explanation into the incident and denied that U.S. helicopters were in Pakistani airspace. Chief Pakistani military spokesman Major General Attar Abbas said that the helicopters had crossed into our territory in Golan Khan area. They passed over our checkposts, so our troops fired warning shots. A few days later, a CIA drone crashed into Pakistan territory. A further split occurred when U.S. troops apparently landed on Pakistani soil to carry out an operation against militants in the Khyber Pakhtunkhwa province. Pakistanis reacted angrily to the action, saying that 20 innocent villagers had been killed by U.S. troops. However, despite tensions, the U.S. increased the use of remotely piloted drone aircraft in Pakistan's border regions, in particular the federally administered tribal areas, FATA, and Balochistan. As of early 2009, drone attacks were up 183% since 2006. By the end of 2008, the Taliban apparently had severed remaining ties with al-Qaeda. According to senior U.S. military intelligence officials, perhaps fewer than 100 members of al-Qaeda remained in Afghanistan. In a meeting with General Stanley McChrystal, Pakistani military officials urged international forces to remain on the Afghan side of the border and prevent militants from fleeing into Pakistan. Pakistan noted that it had deployed 140,000 soldiers on its side of the border to address militant activities, while the coalition had only 100,000 soldiers to police the Afghanistan side. 2009 U.S. reinforcements, Taliban progress. Northern Distribution Network. In response to the increased risk of sending supplies through Pakistan, work began on the establishment of a Northern Distribution Network, NDN, through Russia and Central Asian republics. Initial permission to move supplies through the region was given on January 20, 2009, after a visit to the region by General David Petraeus. The first shipment along the NDN route left on 20 February from Riga, Latvia, then traveled 5,169 kilometers, 3,212 miles, to the Uzbek town of Termez on the Afghanistan border. In addition to Riga, other European ports included Poti, Georgia, and Vladivostok, Russia. U.S. commanders hoped that 100 containers a day would be shipped along the NDN. By comparison, 140 containers a day were typically shipped through the Khyber Pass. By 2011, the NDN handled about 40% of Afghanistan-bound traffic, versus 30% through Pakistan. On May 11, 2009, Uzbekistan President Islam Karimov announced that the airport in Avoy, Uzbekistan, was being used to transport non-lethal cargo into Afghanistan. Due to the still unsettled relationship between Uzbekistan and the U.S. following the 2005 Andijan massacre and subsequent expulsion of U.S. forces from Parshi-Khanabad Air Base, U.S. forces were not involved in the shipments. Instead, South Korea's Korean Air, which overhauled Navoy's airport, officially handled logistics. Originally only non-lethal resources were allowed on the NDN. In July 2009, however, shortly before a visit by new President Barack Obama to Moscow, Russian authorities announced that U.S. troops and weapons could use the country's airspace to reach Afghanistan. Human rights advocates were, as of 2009, concerned that the U.S. was again working with the government of Uzbekistan, which is often accused of violating human rights. U.S. officials promised increased cooperation with Uzbekistan, including further assistance to turn Navoy into a regional distribution center for both military and civilian ventures. 2009 increase in U.S. troops. In January 2009, about 3,000 U.S. soldiers from the 3rd Brigade Combat Team of the 10th Mountain Division moved into the provinces of Logar, Wardak, and Kunar. Afghan Federal Guards fought alongside them. The troops were the first wave of an expected surge of reinforcements originally ordered by President Bush and increased by President Obama. In mid-February 2009, it was announced that 17,000 additional troops would be deployed in 2 brigades and support troops, the 2nd Marine Expeditionary Brigade of about 3,500 and the 5th Brigade, 2nd Infantry Division, a striker brigade with about 4,000. ISAF Commander General David McKiernan had called for as many as 30,000 additional troops, effectively doubling the number of troops. On 23 September, a classified assessment by General McChrystal included his conclusion that a successful counterinsurgency strategy would require 500,000 troops in 5 years. In November 2009, Ambassador Carl W. Eikenberry sent 2 classified cables to Washington expressing concerns about sending more troops before the Afghan government demonstrates that it is willing to tackle the corruption and mismanagement that has fueled the Taliban's rise. Eikenberry, a retired 3-star general who in 2006 to 2007 commanded U.S. troops in Afghanistan, also expressed frustration with the relative paucity of funds set aside for development and reconstruction. In subsequent cables, Eikenberry repeatedly cautioned that deploying sizable American reinforcements would result in astronomical costs, tens of billions of dollars, and would only deepen the Afghan government's dependence on the United States. On November 26, 2009, Karzai made a public plea for direct negotiations with the Taliban leadership. Karzai said there is an urgent need for negotiations and made it clear that the Obama administration had opposed such talks. There was no formal U.S. response. On 1 December, Obama announced at the U.S. Military Academy in West Point that the U.S. would send 30,000 more troops. Anti-war organizations in the U.S. responded quickly, and cities throughout the U.S. saw protests on 2 December. Many protesters compared the decision to deploy more troops in Afghanistan to the expansion of the Vietnam War under the Johnson administration. Kunduz airstrike. On 4 September, during the Kunduz Province campaign, a devastating NATO air raid was conducted 7 kilometers southwest of Kunduz, where Taliban fighters had hijacked civilian supply trucks, killing up to 179 people, including over 100 civilians. Operation Khanjar and Operation Panther's Claw. On 25 June, U.S. officials announced the launch of Operation Khanjar, Strike of the Sword. About 4,000 U.S. Marines from the 2nd Marine Expeditionary Brigade and 650 Afghan soldiers participated. Khanjar followed a British-led operation named Operation Panther's Claw in the same region. Officials called it the Marines' largest operation since the 2004 invasion of Fallujah, Iraq. Operation Panther's Claw was aimed to secure various canal and river crossings to establish a long-term ISAF presence. Initially, Afghan and American soldiers moved into towns and villages along the Helmand River to protect the civilian population. The main objective was to push into insurgent strongholds along the river. A secondary aim was to bring security to the Helmand Valley in time for presidential elections, set to take place on 20 August. Taliban gains. According to a 22 December briefing by Major General Michael T. Flynn, the top U.S. intelligence officer in Afghanistan, the Taliban retains the required partnerships to sustain support, fuel legitimacy and bolster capacity. The 23-page briefing states that security incidents are projected to be higher in 2010. Those incidents were already up by 300% since 2007 and by 60% since 2008, according to the briefing. NATO intelligence at the time indicated that the Taliban had as many as 25,000 dedicated soldiers, almost as many as before 9/11 and more than in 2005. On 10 August, McChrystal, newly appointed as U.S. commander in Afghanistan, said that the Taliban had gained the upper hand. In a continuation of the Taliban's usual strategy of summer offensives, the militants aggressively spread their influence into North and West Afghanistan and stepped up their attack in an attempt to disrupt presidential polls. Calling the Taliban a very aggressive enemy, he added that the U.S. strategy was to stop their momentum and focus on protecting and safeguarding Afghan civilians, calling it hard work. The Taliban's claim that the over 135 violent incidents disrupting elections was largely disputed. However, the media was asked to not report on any violent incidents. Some estimates reported voter turnout as much less than the expected 70%. In southern Afghanistan, where the Taliban held the most power, voter turnout was low and sporadic violence was directed at voters and security personnel. The chief observer of the European Union election mission, General Philippe Morillon, said the election was generally fair but not free. Western election observers had difficulty accessing southern regions, where at least 9 Afghan civilians and 14 security forces were killed in attacks intended to intimidate voters. The Taliban released a video days after the elections, filming on the road between Kabul and Kandahar, stopping vehicles and asking to see their fingers. The video showed 10 men who had voted, listening to a Taliban militant. The Taliban pardoned the voters because of Ramadan. The Taliban attacked towns with rockets and other indirect fire. Amid claims of widespread fraud, both top contenders, Hamid Karzai and Abdullah claimed victory. Reports suggested that turnout was lower than in the prior election. After Karzai's alleged win of 54%, which would prevent a runoff, over 400,000 Karzai votes had to be disallowed after accusations of fraud. Some nations criticized the elections as free but not fair. In December, an attack on Forward Operating Base Chapman, used by the CIA to gather information and to coordinate drone attacks against Taliban leaders, killed at least 6 CIA officers. 2010, American-British Offensive and Afghan Peace Initiative. In public statements, U.S. officials had previously praised Pakistan's military effort against militants during its offensive in South Waziristan in November 2009. Karzai started peace talks with Haqqani network groups in March 2010, and there were other peace initiatives including the Afghan Peace Jirga 2010. In July 2010, a U.S. Army report read, "It seems to always be this way when we go there, to meet civilians. No one wants anything to do with us." A report on meeting up with school representatives mentioned students throwing rocks at soldiers and not welcoming their arrival, as had been reported on several occasions elsewhere. President Zardari said that Pakistan had spent over $35 billion during the previous 8 years fighting against militancy. According to the Afghan government, approximately 900 Taliban were killed in operations conducted during 2010. Due to increased use of IEDs by insurgents, the number of injured coalition soldiers, mainly Americans, significantly increased. Beginning in May 2010, NATO Special Forces began to concentrate on operations to capture or kill specific Taliban leaders. As of March 2011, the U.S. military claimed that the effort had resulted in the capture or killing of more than 900 low to mid-level Taliban commanders. Overall, 2010 saw the most insurgent attacks of any year since the war began, peaking in September at more than 1,500. Insurgent operations increased dramatically in 2/3 of Afghan provinces. Troop surge. Deployment of additional U.S. troops continued in early 2010, with 9,000 of the planned 30,000 in place before the end of March and another 18,000 expected by June, with the 101st Airborne Division as the main source and a Marine Expeditionary Force in the Helmand Province. U.S. troops in Afghanistan outnumbered those in Iraq for the first time since 2003. The CIA, following a request by General McChrystal, planned to increase teams of operatives, including elite SAT officers, with U.S. military special operations forces. This combination worked well in Iraq and was largely credited with the success of that surge. The CIA also increased its campaign using Hellfire missile strikes on al-Qaeda in Pakistan. The number of strikes in 2010, 115, more than doubled the 50 drone attacks that occurred in 2009. The surge in troops supported a 6-fold increase in Special Forces operations. 700 airstrikes occurred in September 2010 alone versus 257 in all of 2009. From July 2010 to October 2010, 300 Taliban commanders and 800 foot soldiers were killed. Hundreds more insurgent leaders were killed or captured as 2010 ended. Petraeus said, "We've got our teeth in the enemy's jugular now, and we're not going to let go." The CIA created counterterrorism pursuit teams, CTPT, staffed by Afghans at the war's beginning. This force grew to over 3,000 by 2010 and was considered one of the best Afghan fighting forces. Firebase Lily was one of SAD's nerve centers. These units were not only effective in operations against the Taliban and al-Qaeda forces in Afghanistan, but have expanded their operations into Pakistan. They were also important factors in both the counterterrorism plus and the full counterinsurgency options discussed by the Obama administration in the December 2010 review. Battle of Marjah. In early February, coalition and Afghan forces began highly visible plans for an offensive, codenamed Operation Mushtarak, on the Taliban stronghold near the village of Marjah. It began on 13th February and, according to U.S. and Afghan officials, was the first operation where Afghan forces led the coalition. Led by the 2nd Marine Expeditionary Brigade, U.S., the offensive involved 15,000 U.S., British, Canadian, Estonian, Danish, French, and Afghan troops. It was the biggest joint operation since the 2001 invasion that ousted the Taliban. The troops were fighting over an area of less than 100 square miles, 260 square kilometers, with a population of 80,000. WikiLeaks disclosure. On July 25, 2010, the release of 91,731 classified documents from the WikiLeaks organization was made public. The documents cover U.S. military incident and intelligence reports from January 2004 to December 2009. Some of these documents included sanitized, and covered up, accounts of civilian casualties caused by coalition forces. The reports included many references to other incidents involving civilian casualties like the Kunduz airstrike and Nangarhar incident. The leaked documents also contain reports of Pakistan collusion with the Taliban. According to Der Spiegel, the documents clearly show that the Pakistani intelligence agency Inter-Services Intelligence, usually known as the IC, is the most important accomplice the Taliban has outside of Afghanistan. Pakistan and U.S. tensions. Tensions between Pakistan and the U.S. were heightened in late September after several Pakistan Frontier Corps soldiers were killed and wounded. The troops were attacked by a U.S.-piloted aircraft that was pursuing Taliban forces near the Afghan-Pakistan border, but for unknown reasons opened fire on two Pakistan border posts. In retaliation for the strike, Pakistan closed the Torkham ground border crossing to NATO supply convoys for an unspecified period. This incident followed the release of a video allegedly showing uniformed Pakistan soldiers executing unarmed civilians. After the Torkham border closing, Pakistani Taliban attacked NATO convoys, killing several drivers and destroying around 100 tankers. 2011, U.S. and NATO drawdown. Battle of Kandahar. The Battle of Kandahar was part of an offensive named after the Battle of Badr that took place on 13 March 624, between Medina and Mecca. The battle followed an 30 April announcement that the Taliban would launch their spring offensive. On 7 May the Taliban launched a major offensive on government buildings in Kandahar. The Taliban said their goal was to take control of the city. At least 8 locations were attacked: the governor's compound, the mayor's office, the NDS headquarters, 3 police stations and 2 high schools. The battle continued on to a second day. The BBC's Bilal Sarwari called it the worst attack in Kandahar province since the fall of the Taliban government in 2001, an embarrassment for the Western-backed Afghan government. Death of Osama bin Laden. On 2 May U.S. officials announced that al-Qaeda leader Osama bin Laden had been killed in Operation Neptune Spear, conducted by the U.S. Navy SEALs, in Pakistan. Withdrawal. On 22 June President Obama announced that 10,000 troops would be withdrawn by the end of 2011 and an additional 23,000 troops would return by the summer of 2012. After the withdrawal of 10,000 U.S. troops, only 80,000 remained. In July 2011 Canada withdrew its combat troops, transitioning to a training role. Following suit, other NATO countries announced troop reductions. The United Kingdom stated that it would gradually withdraw its troops, however it did not specify numbers or dates. France announced that it would withdraw roughly 1,000 soldiers by the end of 2012, with 3,000 soldiers remaining. Hundreds would come back at the end of 2011 and in the beginning of 2012, when the Afghan National Army took control of Shorobi district. The remaining troops would continue to operate in Kapisa. Their complete withdrawal was expected by the end of 2014 or earlier given adequate security. Belgium announced that half of their force would withdraw starting in January 2012. Norway announced it had started a withdrawal of its near 500 troops and would be completely out by 2014. Equally, the Spanish Prime Minister announced the withdrawal of troops beginning in 2012, including up to 40% by the end of the first half of 2013, and complete withdrawal by 2014. 2011 U.S.-NATO attack in Pakistan. After Neptune Spear, ISAF forces accidentally attacked Pakistan's armed forces on 26 November, killing 24 Pakistani soldiers. Pakistan blocked NATO supply lines and ordered Americans to leave Shamsi airfield. NATO Secretary-General Anders Fogh Rasmussen said the attack was tragic and unintended. This, regret, is not good enough. We strongly condemn the attacks and reserve the right to take action, said DGISPR Major General Attar Abbas. This could have serious consequences in the level and extent of our cooperation. 2012 Strategic Agreement. Taliban attacks continued at the same rate as they did in 2011, around 28,000 attacks. In September 2012, the surge of American personnel that began in late 2009 ended. Reformation of the United Front, Northern Alliance. In late 2011, the National Front of Afghanistan, NFA, was created by Ahmad Zia Massoud, Abdul Rashid Dostum and Haji Muhammad Mahakik in what many analysts have described as a reformation of the military wing of the United Front, Northern Alliance, to oppose a return of the Taliban to power. Meanwhile, much of the political wing reunited under the National Coalition of Afghanistan led by Abdullah becoming the main democratic opposition movement in the Afghan parliament. Former head of intelligence Amrullah Saleh has created a new movement, based Milli, Afghanistan Green Trend, with support among the youth mobilizing about 10,000 people in an anti-Taliban demonstration in Kabul in May 2011. In January 2012, the National Front of Afghanistan raised concerns about the possibility of a secret deal between the U.S., Pakistan and the Taliban during a widely publicized meeting in Berlin. U.S. Congressman Louis Gohmert wrote, "These leaders who fought with embedded special forces to initially defeat the Taliban represent over 60% of the Afghan people, yet are being entirely disregarded by the Obama and Karzai administrations in negotiations." After the meeting with U.S. congressmen in Berlin, the National Front signed a joint declaration stating, among other things, "We firmly believe that any negotiation with the Taliban can only be acceptable, and therefore effective, if all parties to the conflict are involved in the process. The present form of discussions with the Taliban is flawed, as it excludes anti-Taliban Afghans. It must be recalled that the Taliban extremists and their al-Qaeda supporters were defeated by Afghans resisting extremism with minimal human embedded support from the United States and international community. The present negotiations with the Taliban fail to take into account the risks, sacrifices and legitimate interests of the Afghans who ended the brutal oppression of all Afghans." High-profile U.S. military incidents. Beginning in January 2012, incidents involving U.S. troops occurred which were described by the Sydney Morning Herald as a series of damaging incidents and disclosures involving U.S. troops in Afghanistan. These incidents created fractures in the partnership between Afghanistan and ISAF, raised the question whether discipline within U.S. troops was breaking down, undermined the image of foreign forces in a country where there is already deep resentment owing to civilian deaths and a perception among many Afghans that U.S. troops lack respect for Afghan culture and people, and strained the relations between Afghanistan and the United States. Besides an incident involving U.S. troops who posed with body parts of dead insurgents and a video apparently showing a U.S. helicopter crew singing "Bye Bye Miss American Pie" before blasting a group of Afghan men with a Hellfire missile, these high-profile U.S. military incidents in Afghanistan also included the 2012 Afghanistan Quran burning protests and the Peshawar shooting spree. Enduring Strategic Partnership Agreement. On May 2, 2012, Presidents Karzai and Obama signed a strategic partnership agreement between the two countries, after the U.S. president had arrived unannounced in Kabul on the first anniversary of Osama bin Laden's death. The U.S.-Afghanistan Strategic Partnership Agreement, officially entitled the Enduring Strategic Partnership Agreement between the Islamic Republic of Afghanistan and the United States of America, provides the long-term framework for the two countries' relationship after the drawdown of U.S. forces. The Strategic Partnership Agreement went into effect on July 4, 2012, according to Secretary of State Hillary Clinton on July 8, 2012 at the Tokyo Conference on Afghanistan. On July 7, 2012, as part of the agreement, the U.S. designated Afghanistan a major non-NATO ally after Karzai and Clinton met in Kabul. On November 11, 2012, as part of the agreement, the two countries launched negotiations for a bilateral security agreement. NATO Chicago Summit, Troops Withdrawal and Long-Term Presence. On May 21, 2012, the leaders of NATO member countries endorsed an exit strategy during the NATO summit. ISAF forces would transfer command of all combat missions to Afghan forces by the middle of 2013, while shifting from combat to advising, training and assisting Afghan security forces. Most of the 130,000 ISAF troops would depart by the end of December 2014. A new NATO mission would then assume the support role. 2013, Withdrawal. Karzai-Obama meeting. Karzai visited the U.S. in January 2012. At the time, the U.S. government stated its openness to withdrawing all of its troops by the end of 2014. On January 11, 2012, Karzai and Obama agreed to transfer combat operations from NATO to Afghan forces by spring 2013 rather than summer 2013. What's going to happen this spring is that Afghans will be in the lead throughout the country, Obama said. They, ISAF forces, will still be fighting alongside Afghan troops. We will be in a training, assisting, advising role. Obama added he also stated the reason of the withdrawals that we achieved our central goal, or have come very close. Which is to decapacitate al-Qaeda, to dismantle them, to make sure that they can't attack us again. Obama also stated that he would determine the pace of troop withdrawal after consultations with commanders. He added that any U.S. mission beyond 2014 would focus solely on counterterrorism operations and training. Obama insisted that a continuing presence must include an immunity agreement in which U.S. troops are not subjected to Afghan law. I can go to the Afghan people and argue for immunity for U.S. troops in Afghanistan in a way that Afghan sovereignty will not be compromised, in a way that Afghan law will not be compromised, Karzai replied. Both leaders agreed that the United States would transfer Afghan prisoners in prisons to the Afghan government and withdraw troops from Afghan villages in spring 2013. The international forces, the American forces, will be no longer present in the villages, that it will be the task of the Afghan forces to provide for the Afghan people in security and protection, the Afghan president said. Security transfer. On June 18, 2013, the transfer of security responsibilities was completed. The last step was to transfer control of 95 remaining districts. Karzai said, when people see security has been transferred to Afghans, they support the army and police more than before. NATO leader Rasmussen said that Afghan forces were completing a 5-stage transition process that began in March 2011. They are doing so with remarkable resolve, he said. 10 years ago, there were no Afghan national security forces, now you have 350,000 Afghan troops and police. ISAF remained slated to end its mission by the end of 2014. Some 100,000 ISAF forces remained in the country. 2014, withdrawal continues and the insurgency increases. After 2013, the Taliban escalated suicide bombings. An example of this is a bombing of a Lebanese restaurant in the Wazir Akbar Khan area of Kabul on February 18, 2014. Among the dead in this attack were UN staff and the owner of a restaurant, who died protecting his business. 21 people altogether were killed. Meanwhile, the withdrawal continued, with 200 more U.S. troops going home. The UK halved their force and were slowing withdrawal with all but 2 bases being closed down. On March 20, 2014, more than 4 weeks after a bomb in a military bus by the Taliban rocked the city once again, a raid on the Serena Hotel's restaurant in Kabul by the Taliban resulted in the deaths of 9 people, including the 4 perpetrators. The attack came just 8 days after Swedish radio journalist Nils Horner was shot dead by the Taliban. However, as the U.S. troops withdrew from Afghanistan, they were replaced by private security companies hired by the United States government and the United Nations. Many of these private security companies, also termed military contractors, consisted of ex-U.S. Army, U.S. Marine, British, French and Italian defense personnel who had left the defense after a few years of active service. Their past relations with the defense helped establish their credentials, simultaneously allowing the U.S. and British to continue to be involved in ground actions without the requirement to station their own forces. This included companies such as the Ohio-based Military Contracting Company, mission essential personnel set up by Sunil Ramchand, a former White House staffer and U.S. Navy veteran. Despite the crisis in Crimea, by March 2014 Russia had not tried to exert pressure on the U.S. via the Northern Distribution Network supply line. On June 9, 2014 a coalition airstrike mistakenly killed 5 U.S. troops, an Afghan National Army member and an interpreter in Kabul Province. On August 5, 2014, a gunman in an Afghan military uniform opened fire on a number of U.S., foreign and Afghan soldiers, killing a U.S. general, Harold J. Green, and wounding about 15 officers and soldiers including a German brigadier general and a large number of U.S. soldiers at Camp Karga, a training base west of Kabul. 2 long-term security pacts, The bilateral security agreement between Afghanistan and the United States of America and the NATO Status of Forces Agreement between NATO and Afghanistan were signed on September 30, 2014. Both pacts lay out the framework for the foreign troop involvement in Afghanistan after the year 2014. After 13 years, Britain and the United States officially ended their combat operation in Afghanistan on October 26, 2014. On that day, Britain handed over its last base in Afghanistan, Camp Bastion, while the United States handed over its last base, Camp Leatherneck, to Afghan forces. As early as November 2012, the US and NATO were considering the precise configuration of their post-2014 presence in Afghanistan. On May 27, 2014, President Barack Obama announced that U.S. combat operations in Afghanistan would end in December 2014, see withdrawal of U.S. troops from Afghanistan. 9,800 troops were to remain, training Afghan security forces and supporting counterterrorism operations against remnants of al-Qaeda. This force would be halved by the end of 2015, and consolidated at Bagram Air Base and in Kabul. All U.S. forces, with the exception of a normal embassy presence, would be removed from Afghanistan by the end of 2016. In 2014, 56 United States service members, and 101 contractors, died in Afghanistan. On December 28, 2014, NATO officially ended combat operations in a ceremony held in Kabul. Continued operations by United States forces within Afghanistan will continue under the name Operation Freedom Sentinel. This was joined by a new NATO mission under the name of Operation Resolute Support. Operation Resolute Support will involve 28 NATO nations, 14 partner nations, 11,000 American troops, and 850 German troops. The Special Operations Joint Task Force, Afghanistan, the remnant U.S. NATO Special Forces Organization, includes a counterterrorism task force. In the words of the U.S. Special Operations Command Factbook for 2015, this task force conducts offensive operations in Afghanistan to degrade the Taliban, al-Qaeda, and the Haqqani networks in order to prevent them from establishing operationally significant safe havens which threaten the stability and sovereignty of government of the Islamic Republic of Afghanistan and the United States. This task force is similar to previous forces such as Task Force 373. The UK officially commemorated the end of its role in the Afghan war in a ceremony held in St. Paul's Cathedral on March 13, 2015. Around 500 UK troops remain in non-combat roles. 2015 Taliban resurgence. The Taliban began a resurgence due to several factors. At the end of 2014, the US and NATO combat mission ended and the withdrawal of most foreign forces from Afghanistan reduced the risk the Taliban faced of being bombed and raided. In June 2014, the Pakistani military's Operation Zarb-e-Azb, launched in the North Waziristan tribal area in June 2014, dislodged thousands of mainly Uzbek, Arab and Pakistani militants, who flooded into Afghanistan and swelled the Taliban's ranks. The group was further emboldened by the comparative lack of interest from the international community and the diversion of its attention to crisis in other parts of the world, such as Syria, Iraq, Yemen, and Ukraine. Afghan security forces also lack certain capabilities and equipment, especially air power and reconnaissance. The political infighting in the central government in Kabul and the apparent weakness in governance at different levels are also exploited by the Taliban. In May 2015, Russia has closed a key military transport corridor which allowed NATO to deliver military supplies to Afghanistan through the Russian territory. On 5 January, a suicide car bomber attacked the HQ of UPAL Afghanistan in Kabul, killing 1 person and injuring 5. The Taliban claimed responsibility. On 15 January, Afghan security officials arrested 5 men in Kabul in relation to their suspected involvement in the 2014 Peshawar school massacre in Pakistan. In mid-January 2015, the Islamic State of Iraq and the Levant established a branch in Afghanistan called Wilaya Khorasan and began recruiting fighters and clashing with the Taliban. However, an Afghan military officer stated that he believed the Afghan military could handle any threat that the group presented in the country. American forces have increased raids against Islamist militants, moving beyond counterterrorism missions. This is partially due to improved relations with the United States due to the Ghani presidency. Reasoning used for these raids include protecting American forces, which has been broadly interpreted. One raid, a joint raid by American and Afghan forces, arrested 6 Taliban connected to the 2014 Peshawar school massacre. American Secretary of Defense Ash Carter traveled to Afghanistan in February 2015. During a period when it was discussed that the U.S. would slow down its withdrawal from Afghanistan. In February 2015, the headquarters element of the U.S. 7th Infantry Division began to deploy to Afghanistan. It will serve as the Resolute Support Missions Train Advise Assist Command, South Headquarters. It will be joined by 10th Mountain Division's 2nd Brigade Combat Team, and 101st Combat Aviation Brigade. On 18 March, Hafiz Wahidi, ISIL's replacement deputy emir in Afghanistan, was killed by the Afghan armed forces, along with 9 other ISIL militants accompanying him. On 19 March, it was reported by Reuters that the U.S. military bases in Kandahar and Jalalabad were likely to remain open beyond the end of 2015, a senior U.S. official said, as the federal government of the United States considered slowing its military withdrawal to help the new government fight the Taliban. The anticipated policy reversal reflected U.S. support of Afghanistan's new and more cooperative president, Ashraf Ghani, and a desire to avoid the collapse of local security forces that occurred in Iraq after the U.S. withdrawal there. On 25 March, the Afghan National Army killed 29 insurgents and injured 21 others in a series of operations in the Daikundi, Ghazni, and Parwan provinces. 11 people, including 1 U.S. service member, died in a Taliban attack on Camp Integrity in Kabul in August. Suicide bombers attacked Hedel Hotel in May. Norwegian Marine Commando and Special Forces were central in saving 37 Australian hostages while maintaining direct contact with the Australian ambassador in Kabul. Throughout 2015, the U.S. launched about 1,000 bombs and missiles at targets in Afghanistan, according to the Council on Foreign Relations. Kabul Parliament attack. On June 22, 2015, the Taliban detonated a car bomb outside the National Assembly in Kabul, and Taliban fighters attacked the building with assault rifles and RPGs. A Taliban fighter driving a car loaded with explosives managed to get through security checkpoints before detonating the vehicle outside the parliament's gates. 6 Taliban insurgents with AK-47 rifles and RPGs took up positions in a construction site nearby. Members of parliament were evacuated to safety, while security forces engaged the insurgents in a 2-hour gun battle. Afghan Interior Ministry spokesman Sadiq Siddiqui said all 7 attackers were killed by police and no MPs were wounded. The UN mission in Afghanistan said a woman and a child were killed in the attack, and 40 civilians were injured. Kunduz Offensive. Heavy fighting has occurred in the Kunduz Province, which was the site of clashes from 2009 onwards. In May, flights into the northern city of Kunduz were suspended due to weeks of clashes between the Afghan security forces and the Taliban outside the city. The intensifying conflict in the northern Chardara district within the Kunduz province led the Afghan government to enlist local militia fighters to bolster opposition to the Taliban insurgency. In June, the Taliban intensified attacks around the northern city of Kunduz as part of a major offensive in an attempt to capture the city. Tens of thousands of inhabitants have been displaced internally in Afghanistan by the fighting. The government recaptured the Chardara district after roughly a month of fighting. In late September, Taliban forces launched an attack on Kunduz, seizing several outlying villages and entering the city. The Taliban stormed the regional hospital and clashed with security forces at the nearby university. The fighting saw the Taliban attack from 4 different districts: Chardara to the west, Aliabad to the southwest, Khanabad to the east and Imam Sahib to the north. The Taliban took the Zakal and Ali Khel villages on the highway leading south, which connects the city to Kabul and Mazar-e-Sharif through Aliabad district, and reportedly made their largest gains in the southwest of Kunduz, where some local communities had picked up weapons and supported the Taliban. Taliban fighters had allegedly blocked the route to the airport to prevent civilians fleeing the city. One witness reported that the headquarters of the National Directorate of Security was set on fire. Kunduz was recaptured by Afghan and American forces on October 14, 2015. Taliban negotiations, 2015 to 2016. Chinese officials have declared that Afghan stability affects separatist movements in the region, including in China's west, as well as the security of the China-Pakistan Economic Corridor. China and Pakistan have been involved in negotiations between the Afghan government and the Taliban. The Quadrilateral Coordination Group, consisting of Afghan, American, Chinese and Pakistani officials, have been inviting the Taliban to discuss peace talks since January 2016, but currently they are presumably preoccupied with fighting each other and the government forces. A meeting between representatives of both sides were expected to take place in early March, but the Taliban stated they would not participate. The bombing of the Kabul Parliament has highlighted differences within the Taliban in their approach to peace talks. In April 2016, President Ashraf Ghani pulled the plug on the Afghan government's failing effort to start peace talks with the Taliban. And due to the Haqqani network's integration into the Taliban leadership, it will now be harder for peace talks to take place. Although leader of the Taliban, Hibatullah Akhundzada, said a peace agreement was possible if the government in Kabul renounced its foreign allies. Taliban infighting, 2015 to 2016. On November 11, 2015, it was reported that infighting had broken out between different Taliban factions in Kabul Province. Fighters loyal to the new Taliban leader Mullah Akhtar Mansur fought a pro-ISIL splinter faction led by Mullah Mansur Dadullah. Even though Dadullah's faction enjoyed the support of foreign ISIL fighters, including Uzbeks and Chechens, it was reported that Mansur's Taliban loyalists had the upper hand. According to Ghulam Jalani Farahi, provincial director of security in Kabul, more than 100 militants from both sides were killed since the fighting broke out. The infighting has continued into 2016. On March 10, 2016, officials said that the Taliban clashed with the Taliban splinter group, led by Muhammad Rasul, in the Shindan district of Herat with up to 100 militants killed. The infighting has also stifled peace talks. As a result of the infighting, which has resulted in Mansur being consumed with a campaign to quell dissent against his leadership, Sirajuddin Haqqani, chief of the Haqqani network, was selected to become the deputy leader of the Taliban in the summer of 2015, during a leadership struggle within the Taliban. Sirajuddin and other Haqqani leaders increasingly run the day-to-day military operations for the Taliban, in particular, refining urban terrorist attacks and cultivating a sophisticated international fundraising network. They have also appointing Taliban governors and began uniting the Taliban. As a result, the Haqqani network is now closely integrated with the Taliban at a leadership level, and is growing in influence within the insurgency, whereas the network was largely autonomous before, and there are concerns that the fighting is going to be deadlier. Tensions with the Pakistani military have also been raised because American and Afghan officials accuse them of sheltering the Haqqanis as a proxy group. Taliban offensive in Helmand Province, 2015 to 2018. In 2015, the Taliban began an offensive in Helmand Province, taking over parts of the province. By June 2015, they had seized control of Dishu and Bagran, killing 5,588 Afghan government security forces. 3,720 of them were police officers. By the end of July, the Taliban had overrun Nowzad district, and on 26 August, the Taliban took control of Musa Allah. The status of the remaining districts, by December 18, 2015, is that Taliban and Afghan security forces are contesting Nari Siraj, Sungin, Kajaki, Natali and Khanjar. Afghan security forces claim to have previously ejected the Taliban from the Khanjar district center, with 42 Taliban fighters killed, while Skarmsur, Washer, and Nawa-i-Barak are believed to be contested. In October 2015, Taliban forces had attempted to take Lashkar Gah, the capital of Helmand Province. The Afghans' 215th Corps and Special Operations Forces launched a counter-offensive against the Taliban in November. Whilst the assault was repelled, Taliban forces remained dug into the city suburbs as of December 2015. December 2015 saw a renewed Taliban offensive in Helmand focused on the town of Sungin. Sungin district fell to the Taliban on 21 December, after fierce clashes that killed more than 90 soldiers in 2 days. It was reported that 30 members of the SAS alongside 60 U.S. Special Forces operators joined the Afghan army in the battle to retake parts of Sungin from Taliban insurgents. In addition, about 300 U.S. troops and a small number of British troops are in Helmand and are advising Afghan commanders at the corps level. On or around 23 December, Approximately 200 Afghan police and army forces were besieged inside the town's police headquarters, with ammunition, military equipment and food having to be airdropped to their positions, with the rest of Sangin being under Taliban control, and an attempted relief mission failing. As of December 27, 2015, the Taliban control the districts of Musa Allah, Nowzad, Bagran, and Isfahan districts of Sangin, Marjah, Kandahar, Nadali, and Kajaki have also experienced sustained fighting according to Muhammad Karim Atal, the chief of the Helmand Provincial Council. Senior American commanders said that the Afghan troops in the province have lacked effective leaders as well as the necessary weapons and ammunition to hold off persistent Taliban attacks. Some Afghan soldiers in Helmand have been fighting in tough conditions for years without a break to see their family, leading to poor morale and high desertion rates. In early February 2016, Taliban insurgents renewed their assault on Sangin, after previously being repulsed in December 2015, launching a string of ferocious attacks on Afghan government forces earlier in the month. As a result, the United States decided to send troops from the 2nd Battalion, 87th Infantry Regiment, 10th Mountain Division, in order to prop up the Afghan 215th Corps in Helmand Province, particularly around Sangin, joining U.S. Special Operations Forces already in the area. On February 23, 2016, CNN announced that Afghan troops pulled out of Nowzad and Musa Allah districts in Helmand Province on 20 and 21 February in what a senior military official said was a tactical move. Head of the local provincial council Muhammad Karim Atal told CNN, Afghan soldiers had paid a heavy price and had recaptured some of the areas in those districts by shedding their blood only few months back, but now because of mismanagement, lack of coordination and weak leadership they left them in the hands of enemies. On March 14, 2016, Khanjar district in Helmand Province fell to the Taliban, and district by district, Afghan troops are retreating back to urban centers in Helmand. In early April 2016, 600 Afghan troops launched a major offensive to retake Taliban-occupied areas of Sangin and the area around it. An Afghan army offensive to retake the town of Kandahar was repelled by the Taliban. Desertions from the army in the area are rife. By July 28, 2016, the outlook on the situation in Helmand Province was good. U.S. military officials are now expecting a major Taliban offensive. General Nicholson said, "Now, fighting season's not over. We anticipate we'll see other enemy attempts to regain territory in Helmand. But thus far, things are on a real positive trajectory." Despite U.S. airstrikes, militants besieged Lashkar-Gah, reportedly controlling all roads leading to the city and areas a few miles away. The U.S. stepped up airstrikes in support of Afghan ground forces. Afghan forces in Lashkar-Gah were reported as exhausted whilst police checkpoints around the capital were falling one by one, whilst the Taliban sent a new elite commando force into Helmand called Sarakita in Pashto. Afghan security forces beat back attacks by Taliban fighters encroaching on Khanjar, just 10 kilometers from Lashkar-Gah. Afghan special forces backed by U.S. airstrikes battled increasingly well-armed and disciplined Taliban militants. An Afghan special forces commander said the Taliban have heavily armed, uniformed units that are equipped with night vision and modern weapons. On August 22, 2016, the U.S. announced that 100 U.S. troops were sent to Lashkar-Gah to help prevent the Taliban from overrunning it, in what Brigadier General Charles Cleveland called a temporary effort to advise the Afghan police. The deployment brought the number of U.S. troops deployed in and around Lashkar-Gah to about 700, according to a spokesman for the provincial governor of Helmand. U.S. forces have been carrying out operations with Afghan forces in the Khanjar area of Nadi Ali district and around the Babaji area. On October 1, 2016, it was reported that Taliban fighters advanced closer to Lashkar-Gah by pushing into a farming district on the other side of the river from the town. Despite pushing back the Taliban with the support of U.S. airstrikes in August, the Afghan government is struggling to reverse the tide of fighting. Local officials said that security forces were engaging insurgents and were expected to begin offensive operations soon. On 10 October, it was reported that the Taliban launched a large-scale attack on Lashkar-Gah, pushing into the town, and were said to have taken Bolan and Nawa. On December 31, 2016, the Taliban continued their assault on the province with attacks on Sangin and Marjah districts. In January 2017, the Marine Corps Times reported that in spring 2017, the U.S. Marine Corps will deploy a task force of 300 personnel, known as Task Force Southwest, for 9 months to southwestern Afghanistan to advise and assist local security forces in countering Taliban gains in the Helmand Province. Officials said the Marines will work alongside key leaders from the Afghan National Army's 215th Corps and the 505th Zone National Police to further optimize their capabilities in that region. Task Force Southwest will comprise mostly more senior military personnel selected from units across 2 Marine Expeditionary Force, including the 6th Marine Regiment. The task force will be replacing the U.S. Army's Task Force Forge, which has conducted a similar advisory role for much of 2016. Some estimates suggest the Taliban has retaken more than 80% of Helmand Province. According to Defense Department statistics, 9 U.S. service members were killed in action and another 70 were wounded there by hostile activity throughout 2016. The Washington Post reported that the Afghan government controlled 2 districts whilst 6 districts are contested and the 6 others are largely controlled by the Taliban. On February 12, 2017, the Huffington Post reported that, according to a UN report, that U.S. aircraft conducted around 30 airstrikes in Helmand Province in the preceding week. According to a UN statement, airstrikes in Sangin district on 9 and 10 February killed as many as 18 civilians. Military.com reported that the Helmand governor's office said 60 Taliban fighters, including 8 commanders, were killed in the recent fighting but denied any civilian deaths. During the early hours of March 23, 2017, Sangin district was captured by the Taliban as they have overrun the district center, the town of Sangin. During earlier phase of the war, almost a quarter of British casualties were caused by fighting for the town, while more recently hundreds of Afghan troops lost their lives defending it. On April 29, 2017, the Donald Trump administration deployed an additional 5,000 U.S. Marines to the southern Helmand Province. This marks the return of U.S. Marines to the province since 2014. The Washington Post reported on April 16, 2018, that the Afghan government believed they had lost Karga and Jarish under control, and have expanded security as far south as Garmsur District Center and as far west as Marjah District Center, but most of those 2 districts and many others remain under Taliban influence or control. On April 1, 2018, Afghan forces, with U.S. air support, launched an offensive in Nadi Ali District. 2016. In January 2016, the U.S. government sent a directive to the Pentagon which granted new legal authority for the U.S. military to go on the offensive against militants affiliated with the ISIL-KP, Islamic State of Iraq and the Levant, Khorasan Province, after the State Department announced the designation of ISIS in Afghanistan and Pakistan as a foreign terrorist organization. ISIS-K formed in January 2015 after it pledged its allegiance to Abu Bakr al-Baghdadi. The number of militants started with around 60 or 70. With most of them coming over the border with Pakistan, but now they range between 1,000 and 3,000 militants, mainly defectors from the Afghan and the Pakistani Taliban, and is generally confined to Nangarhar province but also had a presence in Kunduz province. For 3 weeks in that month, the U.S. military carried out at least a dozen operations, including commando raids and airstrikes, many of these raids and strikes taking place in the Tora Bora region of Nangarhar province. American commanders in Afghanistan said they believed that between 90 and 100 Islamic State militants had been killed in these recent operations. By 11 February, ABC News reported the U.S. military had carried out 20 airstrikes on ISIS in eastern Afghanistan in the previous 3 weeks. On 21 February, The Wall Street Journal reported that, just over a week before, Afghan forces supported by U.S. airstrikes launched an operation dubbed Eagle 18, against ISIL forces in Nangarhar province. Ground forces led by the Afghan army and backed by police and paramilitary groups pushed into Achin district, the group's main base, and dislodged Islamic State from their stronghold. U.S. airstrikes had hit the area almost daily for weeks, killing militants affiliated with Islamic State and weakening their grip on the district. 2 Afghan soldiers were wounded in the operation, but ISIL militants retreated from Achin and other districts. On March 6, 2016, Afghanistan's President Ashraf Ghani announced in the Afghan parliament that the Islamic State has been defeated in the eastern parts of the country. Afghan forces claimed victory following the 21-day operation in Achin and Shinwar districts of Nangarhar province, claiming at least 200 militants killed. The operation was aided by local civilians who set up checkpoints to help maintain security in their villages and later supplemented the Afghan forces. On March 15, 2016, an official confirmed that Islamic State militants had moved into Chahar Dara district of Kunduz province and into Kunar province. In early April 2016, it was reported that U.S. and Afghan forces had killed 1,979 suspected militants, 736 others wounded and 965 detained between April 2015 and March 2016. ISIS militants have also been trying to flee into Ghazni and Nuristan province, whilst a rise in defections from the group to the government and the Taliban. On April 12, 2016, the Taliban announced that they would launch an offensive called Operation Omari. In late June 2016, IS militants attacked police checkpoints in the Khat area of Nangarhar province. Heavy fighting between Islamic State militants and government security forces has claimed dozens of lives in eastern Afghanistan. As many as 36 IS militants are reported to have been killed in the assaults. At least a dozen Afghan security forces and civilians have been killed, with another 18 wounded. The latest attacks indicate the group remains a potent threat to a government already battling an insurgency dominated by the rival Taliban. Afghan forces have been battling the Taliban in northeastern Kunduz as part of the Afghan forces' own spring offensive. On 14 April, hundreds of Taliban and other insurgents attempted to retake Kunduz, however Afghan forces repelled the assault, according to Kunduz provincial police chief, allegedly killing 40 and injuring between 8 and 60 Taliban. Whilst Afghan forces suffered 4 killed and 6 wounded. U.S. surveillance aircraft are supporting Afghan forces as they try to push the Taliban back. There has also been fighting in at least 6 other districts, where a further 28 Taliban fighters were killed with another 28 wounded. On July 18, 2016, at least 100 Taliban fighters attacked Khalai district, Kunduz province, in an attempt to take the district, but Afghan forces pushed them back. 8 Taliban, including a commander, were killed, while 1 Afghan security force member was killed and 3 others wounded. The Taliban executed at least 10 people, some of whom were reportedly off-duty soldiers from the Afghan army on May 31, 2016 after kidnapping up to 220 people from buses and cars at a checkpoint on the Kunduz-Takhar highway. The majority of the passengers were released after they were interrogated by the Taliban insurgents. However, at least 18 individuals still remained hostage. On June 7, 2016, in Ghazni province 12 members of Afghan security forces were killed. They include 7 policemen, 3 soldiers, and 2 officials from the National Directorate of Security. The next day in the northern province of Kunduz, Taliban fighters stopped a bus on a highway near the provincial capital and abducted 40 passengers, the second such abduction in the province in less than 2 weeks. On June 1, 2016, Taliban insurgents stormed a court in the Afghan city of Ghazni, clashing with police for at least an hour in an attack in which 10 people, including all 5 of the militants, were killed, police said. The attack came days after the Taliban vowed to seek revenge for the execution last month of 6 Taliban prisoners by the Afghan government. Another retaliatory attack for the execution of prisoners by the Afghan government came on June 5, 2016. Leaving at least 5 people killed and at least 19 others injured at an appeals court in Polialam in Logar province. Among the 5 killed in the attack was the newly named head of the appeals court. Later same day, an Afghan member of parliament, Sherwali Wardak, was killed by a bomb planted near his residence in the capital Kabul. Another 11 people were injured by the blast. No group has claimed responsibility. In June 2016, President Obama approved a policy to give the U.S. military greater ability to accompany and enable Afghan forces fighting the Taliban. The decision also allows greater use of U.S. air power, particularly in CAS missions. The U.S. commander in Afghanistan, General John Nicholson, will now be able to decide when it is appropriate for American troops to accompany conventional Afghan forces into the field, something they have so far only been allowed to do with Afghan special forces. A senior U.S. defense official said that the expanded powers are only meant to be employed in those select instances in which their engagement can enable strategic effects on the battlefield. Previous U.S. rules of engagement in Afghanistan impose limits on U.S. forces' ability to strike at insurgents, being allowed to take action against the Taliban in moments when their assistance was needed to prevent a significant Afghan military setback. The Taliban are refocusing their attention mostly on Helmand, Kandahar and Uruzgan province, according to U.S. and Afghan military officials, although the insurgents also have struck elsewhere. The Taliban still have a large presence in the region with as many as 25,000 fighters, with more than 30,000 Afghan security forces fighting to quell the group's resurgence. On 24 June, it was reported that in the previous week, the U.S. military had launched its first airstrikes against the Taliban since the change in U.S. policy, carrying out a couple of airstrikes on targets in southern Afghanistan. In July 2016, President Obama announced that he plans to leave 8,400 U.S. troops in Afghanistan when he finishes his term, instead of reducing the number of personnel to 5,500 troops by the end of this year, reflecting the difficulty of drawing down the U.S. presence in the country. Whilst the UK sent up to 50 additional military personnel to Afghanistan, 21 will join the counter-terrorism mission, 15 will be involved in a leadership development at the Afghan Army's Officer Training Academy, and 13 will join the Resolute Support Mission, joining the 450 British troops already in the country. UK troops had been due to leave Afghanistan this year but will now have their mission extended into 2017. On June 30, 2016, 2 suicide bombers attacked an Afghan police convoy carrying recently graduated cadets on the western outskirts of the capital Kabul, killing up to 40 cadets, while injuring 40 more. The incident comes 10 days after an attack on a bus carrying Nepali security guards working for the Canadian Embassy in Kabul that killed 14 people. As of July 2016, the U.S. American Time magazine estimated that at least 20% of Afghanistan was under Taliban control, with southernmost Helmand Province as major stronghold, while a U.S. commanding general in Afghanistan, J.M. Nicholson, stated that Afghan official armed forces casualties had risen 20% compared to 2015. On July 23, 2016, Afghan and U.S. forces began an offensive to clear Nangarhar province of Islamic State militants hours after the Kabul bombing. The operation was dubbed Wrath of the Storm, involving both Afghan regular army and special forces, that is the Afghan army's first major strategic offensive of the summer. The operation was backed by U.S. Special Forces troops and airstrikes. 5 U.S. Special Forces troops were wounded by small arms fire or shrapnel over 24 and 25 July whilst clearing areas of southern Nangarhar with Afghan Special Operations troops. It appeared to be the first reported instance of U.S. troops being wounded in fighting ISIL in Afghanistan. On 26 July, in overnight raid in Khat district during the operation, supported by foreign air support, one of the most important leaders of IS in the region, Saad Emirati, one of the founders of the ISIL-KP, was killed along with 120 other suspected militants killed. By 30 July killed hundreds of his militants in eastern Afghanistan. Afghan troops pushed into Khat district after a heavy air and artillery bombardment that forced Daesh to flee into nearby mountain areas. Afghan forces met little resistance, finding an already destroyed training camp. By 30 July, the provincial governor said that 78 Daesh fighters had been killed in the operation. The operation reclaimed large and significant parts of eastern Afghanistan, forcing Daesh militants back into the mountains of southern Nangarhar. The estimated size of the ISIL-KP in January 2016 was around 3,000, but by July 2016 the number had been reduced to closely 1,000 to 1,500, with 70% of its fighters come from the TTP. On October 4, 2016, a U.S. soldier from B Company, 2nd Battalion, 10th SFG was killed by a roadside bomb blast in Achin, Nangarhar Province. He was on a patrol with Afghan forces during an operation against ISIL-K militants. This marked the first time a U.S. serviceman was killed in combat against his militants in the country. The Washington Post reported that during October, as part of coordinated attacks on several cities in the country in an attempt to retake territory lost during the invasion, Far was besieged for 3 weeks by the Taliban and was only ended with U.S. air support. Afghan intelligence officials said 4 dead Iranian commandos were discovered. Village elders told Afghan provincial officials that many Taliban dead and wounded were taken back across the Iranian border, where the insurgents had been recruited and trained. CNN reported that during the month, U.S. aircraft dropped 203 bombs, missiles and other munitions on Taliban and local ISIS targets in Afghanistan. In December 2016, CNN reported that the Afghan Air Force was just beginning to conduct its first independent airstrikes, whilst the Afghan government had become increasingly reliant on Afghan special forces to carry out the fight against ISIS and the Taliban. The 17,000-strong force is responsible for 70% of offensive military operations, an operational tempo that the commander of the international coalition, General John Nicholson, acknowledged is difficult to sustain. As of December 2016, there are 9,800 U.S. service members in Afghanistan. Nicholson told reporters at the Pentagon that the number of U.S. forces would be reduced to 8,450 by 2017. The U.S. and its 39 coalition partners in Afghanistan are committed to providing support to Afghanistan through 2020. In particular, Nicholson added that the international community had pledged millions of dollars in advisory support to Afghanistan. These commitments would help grow the size of the Afghan special forces. Even with the U.S. providing advisors and airstrikes to the Afghan forces, the U.S. military believes that the government only controls about 64% of the country, with the Taliban controlling about 10% and the remainder being contested by the army and the insurgency. Nicholson also said that U.S.-led operations in 2016 had killed or captured 50 leaders from al-Qaeda and AQIS. On December 24, 2016, Military.com reported that Brigadier General Charles Cleveland said that ISIL-K's presence in the country has been pushed back from nearly a dozen districts to just 2 or 3. The number of its members in Afghanistan had been reduced to about 1,000 from an estimated strength of between 1,500 and 3,000 members the previous year. Overall, U.S. troops in Afghanistan conducted more than 350 operations against the IS and al-Qaeda this year. More than 200 al-Qaeda members were killed or captured. In early December, General John Nicholson said U.S.-led counterterrorism operations and Afghan government forces had killed 12 of the organization's top leaders in the country. U.S. officials have said IS fighters are primarily located in Nangarhar and Kunar provinces and al-Qaeda fighters operate in at least 6 provinces also along the country's eastern border. In January 2017, the Marine Corps Times reported that according to an inspector general, the Afghan army comprises about 169,000 soldiers, but in 2016 they suffered a 33% attrition rate, a 7% increase from 2015. 2016 peace deal. On September 22, 2016, the Afghan government signed a draft peace deal with Hezb-i Islami. According to the draft agreement, Hezb-i Islami agreed to cease hostilities, cut ties to extremist groups and respect the Afghan constitution, in exchange for government recognition of the group and support for the removal of United Nations and American sanctions against Helmand Province, who was also promised an honorary post in the government. The agreement was formalized on 29 September by both Afghan President Ashraf Ghani and Helmand Province, who appeared via video link in the presidential palace, signing the agreement. 2017 Events. In early January 2017, the Marine Corps Times reported that Afghan forces seek to rebuild, following an exhausting 2016 fighting season. 33 districts, which are spread across 16 Afghan provinces, are under insurgent control whilst 258 are under government control and nearly 120 districts remain contested. On February 9, 2017, General John W. Nicholson Jr. told Congress that NATO and allied forces in Afghanistan are facing a stalemate and that he needed a few thousand additional troops to more effectively train and advise Afghan soldiers. He also asserted that Russia was trying to legitimize the Taliban by creating the false narrative that the militant organization has been fighting the Islamic State and that Afghan forces have not. He asserted Russia's goal was to undermine the United States and NATO in Afghanistan. However, he said that the area in which Islamic State fighters operate in Afghanistan had been greatly reduced. A U.S. Special Forces soldier was severely wounded that day when the base he was at was attacked in Helmand Province, raising the number of U.S. troops injured in combat nationwide so far this year to at least 6. Nicholson indicated the soldier was wounded in Sangin. The Military Times reported that on February 26, 2017, a USAF airstrike that killed the Taliban leadership commander Mullah Abdul Salam in Kunduz Province in a joint operation with Afghan security forces. The airstrike marked a renewed strategy by U.S. forces under the Trump administration to remove the Taliban leadership/commanders from the battlefield. The Obama administration's strategy had focused much of its efforts in pushing reconciliation between the Taliban and the central government of Afghanistan, although in June 2016, to turn back the tide of Taliban gains, President Obama changed the rules of engagement to give U.S. commanders more flexibility to provide airstrikes and ground support to struggling Afghan forces, if those efforts were perceived to provide strategic effects. It made the concerted effort to kill high-profile al-Qaeda and Haqqani terrorist groups officially designated as terrorist organizations by the U.S. State Department while attempting to draw down U.S. and NATO forces in the region, having a tangible successes. The Army Times reported that in early March 2017, American and Afghan forces launched Operation Hamza to flush ISIS-K from its stronghold in eastern Afghanistan, engaging in regular ground battles. Stars and Stripes reported that General Dawat Waziri, spokesman for Afghanistan's defense ministry, said that for 4 weeks before 13th of April Nangarhar airstrike, which was part of the operation, Afghan special forces unsuccessfully attempted to penetrate the area because of the difficult terrain and improvised explosive device, IEDs, planted by ISIS-KP militants. The governor of Helmand Province Ismail Shinwari confirmed to the BBC that 2 weeks preceding the strike that Afghan special forces, with the U.S. air support, had begun anti-IS operations in the area 2 weeks ago. In April 2017, The Washington Post reported that Captain Bill Salvin, a spokesman for NATO's mission to Afghanistan, said that Afghan and international forces had reduced ISIS-K-controlled territory in Afghanistan by 2/3 and had killed around half their fighters in the previous 2 years. Since the beginning of 2017, 460 airstrikes against terrorists, with drone strikes alone killing more than 200 IS militants. He added that the affiliate has an estimated 600 to 800 fighters in 2 eastern Afghan provinces. On April 13, 2017, the United States dropped the largest non-nuclear bomb, known as the GBU-43/B Massive Ordnance Air Blast, MOAB, mother of all bombs, at 34.073336, 70.631215, latitude and longitude coordinates, near Momand village upon Nangarhar Zachin district village in eastern Afghanistan to destroy tunnel complexes used by the Islamic State of Iraq and the Levant, Khorasan Province, ISIL-KP or ISIS-K. The Guardian reported that following the strike, U.S. and Afghan forces conducted clearing operations and airstrikes in the area and assessed the damage. On April 21, 2017, Islamic Emirate of Afghanistan fighters along with Afghan security forces allied to them stormed 209th Corps military base near Mazar-e-Sharif, killing over 140 Afghan soldiers. On April 28, 2017, The Washington Post reported that the Taliban announced the beginning of their spring offensive dubbed Operation Mansouri. On 20th May, Islamic Emirate of Afghanistan fully secured Wagaz district in the province of Ghazni, while at the same time stormed Dahyak district center and blew up Governor of Ghazni compound in Ghazni city. Another major assault took place on 22nd May in Shah Wali Kot district, northern Kandahar province, during which Taliban managed to capture large military base, while inflicting heavy casualties to the Afghan army, reportedly killing 35 and capturing 4 soldiers as well as 3 armored personnel carriers. During the same day they had overran a border outpost in southern Shorabek district, killing 15 soldiers, in addition to another outpost in district of Kakrais, killing 8 more. The next day rebels assaulted another military base in Shah Wali Kot and an outpost, killing 4 soldiers and injuring 4 more, while pro-government forces abandoned a village in northern district of Maruf. On 24th May Taliban assaulted a base in Maiwan district killing 13 soldiers. Taliban launched another attack in province of Kandahar on 26th May, killing at least 18 soldiers, injuring 16 more and capturing 4 according to security officials, while the group itself claimed to have killed 35 soldiers and capturing 7 more, while also seizing 7 armored personnel carriers and an array of weapons. On 27th May, 13 members of Khost Provincial Force, a CIA-funded and equipped paramilitary group, known for torture and extrajudicial killings, were killed after a Taliban car bomb blew up in Khost City. On May 31, 2017, the German embassy in Kabul was attacked by a suicide truck, located in a heavily fortified area of Kabul, killing over 90 and injuring over 350. No one has claimed responsibility for the attack yet. The bomb went off at about 8:25 local time, 3:55 GMT, during rush hour. The fortified area is considered the safest area of Kabul, with 3 meters, 10 feet, tall blast walls. India's Foreign Minister Sushma Swaraj said its embassy staff were safe. On August 23, 2017, the Taliban captured the district of Zanakan in Ghazni province after a series of clashes with Afghan security forces. The Guardian reported that following the announcement of Donald Trump's new strategy in the country, more than 900 munitions were released in August and September, bringing the total number of munitions used in 2017 to nearly 3,000, more than twice the expended munitions in 2016. On October 14, 2017, The Guardian reported that there were then between 600 and 800 ISIL-KP militants left in Afghanistan, who are mostly concentrated in Nangarhar province. CNN reported that throughout October, U.S. aircraft dropped 653 bombs, missiles and other munitions on Taliban and local ISIL targets in Afghanistan, Military officials said that the success against ISIS in Iraq and Syria has freed up air assets to be deployed to Afghanistan and other theaters. The Washington Post reported that on November 20, 2017, General John W. Nicholson announced that U.S. aircraft were targeting drug production facilities in Afghanistan under a new strategy aimed at cutting off Taliban funding, saying that the Taliban was becoming a criminal organization that was earning about $200 million a year from drug-related activities. President Ashraf Ghani strongly endorsed the new campaign of U.S. and Afghan airstrikes against the Taliban-run narcotic centers. The following day, a spokesman for the Helmand governor's office said that the past week's air operations involving coalition forces and Afghan Air Force planes conducted direct strikes on Taliban hideouts and narcotics centers, 8 strikes by the coalition and 2 by the Afghan Air Force, killing more than 40 Taliban fighters, and that a main processing center of narcotics was destroyed along with about 2,200 pounds of drugs. CNN reported that the campaign is known as Operation Jagged Knife. 3 of the strikes occurred in Kajaki district, 4 in Musa Allah and 1 in Songhain. A Pentagon spokesman said that the airstrikes were carried out by US F-16s and B-52s. General Nicholson told reporters at the Pentagon that a US F-22 Raptor and Afghan Air Force A-29s also participated in the strikes. Nicholson estimated that there are approximately 400 to 500 such facilities in Afghanistan and that these operations will continue on in the coming days. CNN also reported that General Nicholson said our priorities been in Iraq and Syria, and, as we continue to see success there, we hope to see more assets coming over to enable us to do more of these kinds of operations. The strikes marked the first time commanders used their newly granted authorities to target Taliban revenue sources. Vice President Mike Pence announced on December 21, 2017 that Afghan President Ashraf Ghani told him that more senior Taliban leaders had been killed in 2017 than in all prior years of the war combined. Pence also stated that the USA was making great progress with the war in Afghanistan. Donald Trump's Afghanistan policy. On August 21, 2017, U.S. President Donald Trump stated that he would expand the American presence in Afghanistan, without giving details on how or when. Trump did not formulate any timelines, troop numbers or specific purposes to be met, only that a U.S. withdrawal was not an option now as it would play into the hands of terrorists and that publicizing deadlines and exact plans would only help those groups prepare. Trump also said that 20 U.S. designated terrorist organizations are active in Afghanistan and Pakistan. According to the Washington Post, this contradicts the official U.S. government list, which only has 13 such organizations. The Guardian reported that Afghan government officials praised the new strategy, not only for increasing troop numbers and removing with strict timelines, but for increasing pressure on Pakistan, which they see as a main sponsor of the insurgency. In a televised address, President Trump said a new approach to Pakistan would be a pillar of the new strategy, adding that we can no longer be silent about Pakistan's safe havens for terrorist organizations, the Taliban and other groups that pose a threat to the region and beyond. Najibullah Azad, a spokesman for the Afghan president, said that the strategy is made in accordance with realities on the ground, and that this is the first time the U.S. government is coming with a very clear-cut message to Pakistan to either stop what you're doing or face the negative consequences. Other statements by Afghan officials such as Dawood Muradian, the Director General of the Afghan Institute for Strategic Studies in Kabul, said that the new strategy is premised on peace through strength, in contrast to Obama's failed approach, which was essentially peace through appeasement. In response, Pakistani security officials accused Trump of shifting blame for its failures in the war against the Taliban and other armed groups in Afghanistan and of endangering the already fraught bilateral relations between the two countries. On September 15, 2017, The New York Times reported that the CIA was looking to reportedly seeking authority to conduct its own drone strikes in Afghanistan and other war zones. According to current and former intelligence and military officials, the change in authority was being considered by the White House as part of the new strategy, despite concerns by the Pentagon. On September 19, 2017, the Trump administration deployed another 3,000 U.S. troops to Afghanistan. They will add to the approximately 11,000 U.S. troops already serving in Afghanistan, bringing the total to at least 14,000 U.S. troops stationed in Afghanistan. On October 4, 2017, Fox News reported that Defense Secretary Jim Mattis approved a change in rules of engagement as part of the new strategy so that there is no longer a requirement for U.S. troops to be in contact with enemy forces in Afghanistan before opening fire. 2018 Events. In January 2018, the BBC reported that the Taliban are openly active in 70% of the country, being in full control of 14 districts and have an active and open physical presence in a further 263, and that Islamic State is more active in the country than ever before. Following attacks by the Taliban and Islamic State that killed scores of civilians, President Trump and Afghan officials decided to rule out any talks with the Taliban. On February 15, 2018, The New York Times reported the rise of Afghan civilians being intentionally targeted by the Taliban, based on an annual United Nations report released a week earlier. This report offered a detailed assessment of the 16-year Afghan war, showing the rise of complex bombing attacks deliberately targeting civilians in 2017, having 10,453 Afghan civilians wounded or killed. As the U.S. and Afghan government are publishing fewer statistics, the UN report is one of the most reliable indicators about the war's impact by 2018. The report emphasizes the rise of complex attacks, a type of suicide assault that is becoming more deadly, described by the New York Times as the hallmark of the war in 2018. These attacks are referred to as the Taliban's ferocious response to U.S. President Trump's new strategy of war, an increased pace of aerial bombardments targeting Taliban and Islamic State militants, giving the message that the Taliban can strike at will, even in the capital city, Kabul. The UN report included a statement showing the Taliban's position. The Taliban blamed the US and its allies for fighting war in Afghanistan, and it denied targeting civilians. The New York Times quoted Atikla Markle, a retired general and military analyst based in Kabul, saying that the UN report proved the failure of peace talks, as the Taliban and the US government are both determined for victory rather than negotiating settlement. He said more airstrikes mean more suicide attacks, proving the intensification of the war by 2018. In August 2018, Eric Prince, founder and former head of the Blackwater private security firm, said that the war could be ended by privatization. However, the U.S. Defense Secretary James Mattis rebuked the idea, saying, "When Americans put their nation's credibility on the line, privatizing it is probably not a wise idea." The U.S. war in Afghanistan turned 17 in October 2018. In September 2018, the United Nations raised concerns over the increasing number of civilian casualties due to airstrikes in Afghanistan. The U.S. Air Force dropped around 3,000 bombs in the first 6 months of the year, to force Taliban militants for peace talks. In a statement issued by the UNAMA, it reminded all the parties involved in the conflict to uphold their obligations to protect civilians from harm. On October 17, 2018, days before parliamentary election, Abdul-Jabbar Karman, an election candidate, was killed in an attack by Taliban. The Taliban issued a statement, warning teachers and students to not participate in the upcoming elections or use schools as polling centers. On December 17, 2018, U.S. diplomats held talks with Taliban at the United Arab Emirates on possibly ending the war. The Taliban gave conditions of a pullout date for U.S.-led troops before any talks with the Kabul government and has demanded that Washington not oppose the establishment of an Islamist government. However, the U.S. officials have insisted in keeping some troops and at least a couple of bases in the country. The meeting was described by U.S. officials as part of efforts by the United States and other international partners to promote an intra-Afghan dialogue aimed at ending the conflict in Afghanistan.